Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon and greetings from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as director of this institute, which has been established to build bridges between our university and Europe. Welcome to our virtual panel on the war in Ukraine, reassessing the Russian invasion. On January 26, 2022, 1 month before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Nanovic Institute brought together a virtual panel of experts to discuss what was then an alarming and escalating threat. 1 year on, the same panel will discuss how the war has unfolded and the current state of the crisis from the lens of international law and security and the viewpoint of Ukrainians today. Please allow me to repeat what I said a year ago. The situation is worrisome with new developments every day. Just looking at the BBC website this morning, which was January 26, 2022, we can read, I quote, Mr. Biden said there would be enormous consequences for the world if Russia made a move on the nation, which sits on its southwestern border. His comments came as other Western leaders repeated warnings that Russia would pay a heavy price for invasion. Russia has accused the US and others of escalating tensions over the issue and denies planning to enter Ukraine. However, Moscow has deployed an estimated 100,000 soldiers near the border. The Kremlin has said it sees the Western military alliance NATO as a security threat and is demanding legal guarantees that it will not add new members further east, including neighboring Ukraine. But the US has said the issue at stake is Russian aggression, not NATO expansion. Fears of invasion have prompted Western embassies in Kyiv to withdraw some personnel. Diplomats from Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France will gather in Paris on Wednesday for talks about the ongoing tensions. End of quote. A year ago, I also said that it is no secret that the Nanovic Institute has a special relationship with Ukraine, especially the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. In 2019, President Father Jenkins presented the Notre Dame Award to Ukrainian Catholic Archbishop Boris Kutsiak for his work for religious and academic freedom, for his courageous and visionary leadership of the first Catholic university established in the territory of the former Soviet Union. Now, a year on, many people have died, many buildings have been destroyed, many relationships, personal and international, have changed. About a week ago in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Archbishop Boris Kuciak made some deep remarks. He said, Ukraine is now an epicenter of global change, politically, diplomatic, military, economic, ecological, and agricultural. But there is something even more important. It is an epicenter of anthropological reflections. It is a place that is forcing us to ask the question of what it means to be human. Our humanity is our life. Our life is framed by death, and it is where we answer the question of what is life and what is death, so that we understand who we are. End of quote from Archbishop Boris. The peaceful world order has been disrupted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We want to explore the situation we are in with a distinguished panel, bringing together the very same three panelists who reflected on the situation a year ago. The first of our panelists and speakers is a senior leader of the Ukrainian Catholic University, Taras Stopko. Taras is senior vice rector of the Ukrainian Catholic University since 2008, after having served as vice rector for academic affairs for 5 years. He has been with us the last year as a visiting scholar in the Nanovic Institute, and increasingly became an ambassador of the Ukrainian people here on campus. He has become a dear friend, and since then, Taras has returned to Ukraine, and he will comment on the situation we find ourselves in as a university leader, a philosopher, a citizen, and a Christian. Welcome, Taras, and thank you so much for joining us from Ukraine.
Thank you, Clemens.
Thank you. The second panelist will be Mary Ellen O'Connell. Mary Ellen is the Robert and Marion Short Professor of Law and Research Professor of International Dispute Resolution at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies here in Notre Dame. Her focus is on general international law, international legal theory, international dispute resolution, and the international law on the use of force. She's a dear colleague, an important voice also for the current understanding the current situation. She's the author or editor of numerous books and articles, including, most relevant to this topic, The Crisis in Ukraine. Professor O'Connell was a Marshall Scholar and holds a BA in History from Northwestern, an MSc from LSE, and an LLB and PhD from Cambridge. So many titles, Mary Ellen, and a JD from Columbia. I don't know how you do that. Mary Ellen will reflect on the situation from a legal perspective. Thank you, Mary Ellen, for being with us once again. Our third panelist and last speaker will be Michael Desch. Michael Desch is PhD Professor of Political Science and Brian and Janelle Brady Family Director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. He served 2 terms as chair of the Department of Political Science. He is, as you know, a commentator on current affairs, a very important voice here on campus. He received his BA with honors in political science from Marquette, and an AM in international relations, and a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He has worked at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at the Department of State, in the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service. Mike will offer security studies and political science perspective. Thank you so much, Mike, for being with us, representing your field and so much more. Each panelist will offer her or his insights for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will have time for some questions and comments. Please make use of the form that you can access as usual to send in your questions. We will end on time after 1 hour, since we want to respect people's busy schedules. It is a 7 hours time difference, so Taras, I mean, it's getting close to midnight in Ukraine. So again, welcome all, and please, Taras, if I could give the floor to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Clemens, and greetings to all. I'm really glad I could be with you today. I remember last year when we met for a virtual panel, there was actually much uncertainty. Will Russia invade full scale or limit itself to local operations in the eastern part of the country? In the case of invasion, how far would Russia go in its attempt to subjugate Ukraine? Will Ukrainians resist the occupation, or will they give up on resistance? What support would the civilized world provide for Ukraine in the case of invasion? What effect Russia's aggression would have on the global security order? Against all odds, Ukraine has survived. Ukrainians are nearly unanimous in their commitment to defeat the aggression, and the world came united in supporting Ukraine and curtailing Putin's imperial ambitions. But new uncertainties emerge and cause new worries. Will Ukraine, aided by the West, be able to win and restore its territorial integrity? How to prevent Russia from using its nuclear weapon when faced with the prospect of its military defeat in Ukraine? How to negotiate just peace? How to bring Russia to justice for its crimes in Ukraine? How to address Putinism and Russia's imperialism after the war? How to help Ukraine to recover from the war? How to achieve a lasting peace and restore a meaningful international order in the region? There is no way, to answer all these questions in 8 minutes, of course. So I'm going to limit myself to a few remarks by responding to 3 questions from the Ukrainian perspective. So how this war changed Ukraine, how, to my mind, it changed the West, and what has changed and what not in Russia. So how did the war change Ukraine? On the one hand, it will be possible to talk about lasting changes only when the war is over. Nowadays, no surprise, everything is subordinated to the cause of victory. Foreign policy, for example, is mostly about persuading how to send more weapons to Ukraine. The national political agenda is also quite ascetic, how to survive and keep the country going. On the level of ordinary life, people are preoccupied with how to manage the most necessary things while they still have electricity in their apartments. More than 60% of Ukrainians felt great stress during the war, during the last year. 70% say that their income has decreased. 30% are separated from their family in one way or another. About 20% lost their job. 16% mourn the loss of their loved ones. About 40% survived some kind of bombing or shelling. So did Ukrainians get used to war? No, I must say it continues to hurt very much. Are Ukrainians tired of war? Yes, but they keep fighting. So though life's agenda became simplified in a way and often reduced to just getting along, Ukrainians proved that they could face danger and continue to create arts, manufacture goods, learn new things, and live human lives. It's also important to understand that at the heart of the Ukrainian resistance, there are not only people with weapons, but also people of culture, teachers, poets, musicians, artists, priests, and many others. So Ukrainians want to talk not only about bombings, missiles, kinds of weapons. There is a demand for meaning, I would say. Unlike Russians, we are not arrested by the thought that we could change nothing. There is a strong feeling that we are making some kind of history and can shape our future. So no wonder Ukrainians stay very united in their resistance to the aggressor. 92% feel strongly or at least partially involved in the national struggle. The cohesion of the society has increased significantly. Ukrainians finally started owning the state and appreciating its value. Mutual support is also very strong. 85% of Ukrainians are not ready for any territorial concessions. On the other hand, the mental gap between population groups defined by the form of their reaction to the war is growing between those who are actively engaged in the war, like veterans or volunteers, those who went abroad, and those who remained in the occupied territory. So we will need at some point a thoughtful dialogue between these groups. Ukraine is definitely shaking off so-called Sovok, the remnants of its post-Soviet identity, which is perceived as connecting it to Russia. Most Ukrainians, 73%, positively assess the collapse of the Soviet Union. If there was a referendum, 96% would have voted for joining the EU, while a year ago it was 20 points less. Even greater transformations of public opinion took place about Ukraine joining NATO. Until 2013, NATO was very unpopular in Ukraine. If there had been a referendum in 2005, only 16% would have voted for joining NATO. After Russia seized Crimea and started the war in Donbass, support for NATO tripled to 48%. In December 22, 86% of Ukrainians are in favor of joining NATO. There are changes in the language practices in Ukraine. There is an increase in the share of respondents who speak mainly Ukrainian in their everyday life. So people change also the language practices, as I said. Compared to 2017, the share of full and predominantly Ukrainian speakers increased by 8%, and the share of Russian speakers decreased by as much as 11%. In 2017, 60% believed that the Ukrainian language should be the main language of all spheres of communication, and 33% that Ukraine should be a bilingual country. In 2022, 80% were in favor of a predominantly Ukrainian-speaking public space, and only 15% were in favor of bilingualism. Ukraine is also getting rid of Russia's imperial presence in its public space. Most Ukrainians, 60%, support the renaming of toponyms associated with the Russian Federation, the USSR, and the Russian Empire. Streets, schools, public buildings are stripped of their Russian connection and renamed in commemoration of the fallen combatants in this war. Monuments to Russian tsars, generals, politicians, poets, and writers are removed from streets and squares and put into museums. Putin has achieved the exact opposite of what he aspired. He is pushing Ukraine into becoming anti-Russian for generations to come. The post-Soviet type of the Ukrainian identity, together with its main ideological components of attachment to Russia, the Russian world, the imaginary East Slavic community, was morally discredited and politically legitimized. How this war changed the West? I think a tectonic change happened in the perception of Ukraine itself. First, we witnessed liberation of the Western mind from the Russian narrative about Ukraine, not a colony, not a province in which nothing happens and there is no history, not just a borderland or a front line between civilizations. Now it is a space where the rethinking of the global issues happens. A Ukrainian historian, Yaroslav Hrytsak, claims that in this sense, I quote, Ukraine is like the Palestine of the 21st century, allegedly local conflict, but has a decisive influence on world politics, end of quote. Second, almost no one believed in the viability of the Ukrainian state, that Ukrainian institutions are stable and resilient. We felt that our independence and our subjectivity as a state was not taken seriously enough. Nowadays, there is no need anymore to prove that the voice of Ukraine must be heard and considered. I also hope that people in the West realize that neither NATO nor any other external circumstances created an aggressive and criminal Russia. Evil could just emerge in certain places, in certain societies, and make its way to people's heart and minds. Such evil will not become good if approached just with appeasement, negotiations, or market transactions. It's important to realize that the rational arguments might not work when confronted with such an evil, and the only option left is to fight to stop the bully. So I believe that the West started to realize what kind of evil Putin's regime represents. We cannot confront a threat successfully if we don't understand it well. The Russian war is not a war for resources. Russia has a lot of them. It's not for capturing the cities. These are almost fully destroyed on the way of Russian army. One of the striking features of this war is that almost nobody could tell what Putin's ultimate goals are, not even Putin's propagandists or followers in Russia. Is it liberation of the Donbass? Is it the annexation of Russian historical territories? But then what are those and where they end? Is Poland part of these territories or not? Nobody knows for sure. Is it destruction of Ukraine as a state? Is Putin after the restoration of the Soviet Union? Is he after the international order according to the spheres of influence? French political analyst Nicolas Tenzer believes that Putin seeks no positive goal that we can envision. It's a war of destruction, a new kind of barbarism in the 21st century. Tenzer defines Putinism as an ideology of pure destruction. This is what makes any meaningful conversation with Putin almost impossible. What about Russia? I believe the Kremlin learned very little. At least Russians seem to come to realize that Ukrainians are not one people with them, even if seduced, so to speak, by the West into believing that we are different. Viktor Medvedchuk, one of the former Ukrainian politicians who became a traitor and was exchanged for Ukrainian captives, wrote an article last week advocating for the need of creating a new pro-Russian movement in Ukraine. And he was mocked by Russian nationalist propagandists as being out of touch with reality. They start claiming that Ukrainians are different and impossible to correct. Does it mean for those propagandists that Russians should stop war on Ukraine? Unfortunately not. The Kremlin has not resigned on its maximalist objective to destroy Ukraine, at least in words. It believes that Ukrainians must be driven away from the allegedly Russian historical territories, and apparently we don't have any right to be there. Russia doesn't want to give up its policy of predation, and Putin keeps looking at Ukraine like Tolkien's Gollum on his precious ring. Putin more and more comes to frame this war in apocalyptic terms, far more than an effort to protect Russian language speakers in the Donbass, but as a sort of civilizational struggle with the West, as a moral struggle against decadent and rotten Europe, as a spiritual struggle against Satan and God-forsaken America. So the Kremlin would like the Russian people to believe that a withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine would lead to Russia's collapse, and keeps communicating Putin's message, why do we need, I quote Putin, why do we need the world if there is no Russia in it? All of this makes peace with Putin Russia more difficult or even impossible. The only solution is to defeat Putin sooner rather than later. Its defeat is vital not only for the future of Ukraine, but also for the future of European security and international order. There is hope for that. Once unthinkable, Ukraine's military victory is now not something unimaginable. A policy of concession would not lead to peace, but pave the way for the next war. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Taras, for reminding us of the old uncertainties and the new uncertainties, referring to the use of nuclear weapons, the question of the just peace, reminding us of the new unity within Ukraine and the social cohesion, and also the unity of the world. Reminding us of the great stress and the great suffering where people in Ukraine have to go through. They are not getting used to the war, you told us. You told us also about the demand for meaning, the demand for culture. And you reminded us of the question, are there rational arguments that can be used, or may they maybe not work, given also the apocalyptic terms that Putin is using? Thank you so much. And now we move to Mary Ellen O'Connell for a legal perspective or whatever you want to offer, Mary Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clemens, and thank you, Taras. My remarks will build on what you've just said. Let's think of them as taking a step a bit away from the center of Ukraine to a somewhat broader international perspective, but also, like you, fundamentally a normative one. I want to make, as you did, 3 general points. First, I'm going to contend that the Russian war on Ukraine is the most significant armed conflict since the adoption of the United Nations Charter in 1945. Then I want to turn back to a year ago and talk about why the war occurred, what the factors were that we had actually foreseen a year ago that came to play and resulted in this horrific armed conflict. And finally, I want to talk about what needs to be done now so that Ukraine can prevail and so that the international community will come away from this armed conflict with a reinforced system for peace in the post-war era. First, about significance. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the most egregious armed conflict since 1945. It was in that year that 54 countries, in the wake of the World War that devastated most of the globe, 60 million people killed, codified the ancient moral and legal prohibition on resort to war in the United Nations Charter. The Charter provides only 2 exceptions, very narrow, for ever resorting to military force lawfully. And those are when the Security Council gives its consent and when a country has been attacked, has been the recipient of an armed attack, a significant armed attack, for which a military response is both necessary and proportional to reestablishing its defense. And in that case, it may ask for assistance in collective self-defense. Well, I can name probably 300 armed conflicts since 1945 that violate these rules. But in only 2 cases has one state attempted to eliminate another sovereign state member of the United Nations through a war of conquest. The first case was in 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United Nations Security Council on that occasion voted swiftly and unanimously to condemn the violation, to institute sanctions, and eventually authorize the use of military force. The world was united. Iraq had only one other country in the world that supported it. With this unanimity and tangible global support of all kinds, Kuwait was liberated in 100 hours of combat, not 100 days or months, hours. Much has changed since then, including declining knowledge of international law, and more importantly, respect for international norms. The current pro-Ukrainian coalition has started out much smaller from the beginning than the one that supported Kuwait, and is now, I'm afraid, declining. The UN General Assembly voted by a very large margin on March 2nd to condemn Ukraine's invasion. 141 countries voted to condemn out of 193 members. But that leaves 52 states, a significant number, that did not vote to condemn. In trying to explain Iraq's failure to vote against Russia, Iraqi human rights lawyer Yanar Mohammed said she saw personally no difference between US's unlawful uses of force against Iraq, recall the lawless 2003 invasion, and what Russia was doing to Ukraine. There is a difference. But the point I want to make now is that these major violations, whether of Iraq's sovereignty or of Ukraine's, are major violations against the war since the end of the Cold War. All of these violations up to Russia's invasion have undermined the pull to compliance of the UN Charter prohibition on the use of force. So Russia's attempt to eliminate Ukraine comes at a more dangerous time than that of 1991. The risk to the global order, which Taras spoke to, has never been greater. It's immense. And that was not true when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Russia has put the global economic system, the system of human rights and international humanitarian law, and the chance to defend the climate and the natural environment, as well as the state system itself, at risk. The war's significance is also counted in the lives in the war lost and throughout the world through food and fuel shortages. Russian President Putin has shown utter contempt for the international community's law through the invasion and through constant attacks on civilian targets that amount to the use of terror as a weapon of war. That is why, in my view, Ukraine must be supported. It must prevail in this conflict. A Russian defeat of Ukraine, even in the short run, will only introduce more chaos in the world than anything we have seen during the first year of the war. Foreseeing these consequences in late January 2022, I argued for a three-part approach to prevent the conflict. I urged high-level negotiations that took seriously Russia's security concerns, including the Russian complaint that the United States and its allies constantly behaved as if they were above the rules, while Russia needed to comply. In 2016, Russia said in its foreign policy concept that one of its main foreign policy goals was to counter politically motivated and self-interested attempts by some states to arbitrarily interpret the fundamental international legal norms and principles, such as the non-use of force or threat of force, peaceful settlement of international disputes, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, to counter attempts to represent violations of international law as creative examples of such norms. My argument was last year for a renewed commitment by the US and Russia to strict compliance with the UN Charter. But I also emphasized, while more had to be done to ensure that the rules of the international community were respected by all and give Russia more confidence that these rules would be complied with, I also pointed out that the world had to be ready to sanction any serious violation by Russia in the course of the negotiations and recommitment to the rule of law. I had urged the same thing after the 2014 occupation of Crimea and fighting in the East. In particular, I said on both occasions that Germany needed to be ready immediately to cut all fossil fuel purchases from Russia and send a message of what the cost would be for a Russian invasion. That, of course, did not happen. So I'm arguing for two steps to be taken now. First and foremost, the continuing, immediate, tangible support of all kinds, military, economic, diplomatic, all types of support. And that comes on this day to a plea by me for Germany to send 200 Leopard 2 tanks immediately. Germany has announced that it will send the Leopard 2 in response to President Zelensky's request for 300 Leopards. Germany has announced sending 14. There's no excuse for this. Germany has 200 Leopards in storage, ready to roll out in a few days. They need to go. We need to continue the pressure from all kinds, but this is critical in the moment. To win the peace also means renewing the stature of law against war. It's pulled to compliance. It must again be anathema to initiate armed conflict. We hear again and again, and we heard it from Taras just now, that so much of this tragedy is due to a choice by Putin, to his psychology, to his strange wish to be reviewed as great. If the United States and Ukraine's allies want Ukraine to win the war and see the lasting peace, they have to make it clear what it means to be great in the world, to raise the barrier to a person with psychosis like Putin from believing that he will become great through violation. The international law Russia has violated has been eroded for years by the very states now protesting Russia's violation of the rules-based order. Russia's violation is a different order of magnitude, but we reach this place through steadily claiming to be above the rules, a place sought now by Putin. But no state, no person is above the ancient normative law against resort to violence. Ukraine needs high regard for international law. It needs a strong sense of duty by all of us to stand by the victim of a grave legal violation and the law in general. Ukrainians need us all to know that it is a grave violation to invade and attempt to conquer another country. And my last comment, Ukrainians and all victims of violence also need our constant prayers for peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen. Also for the comparison between 1990 and the UN's reaction to the invasion of Kuwait and the UN's reaction to the invasion of Ukraine. Thank you for your clear point about Ukraine must be supported and Putin must not win. And the two steps, any tangible support for Ukraine and renew the statute of law against war and remind those who think that they can get away with criminal acts that this should not be possible. Thank you, Mary Ellen. And now moving to Mike Dash in a security perspective and probably a realistic assessment of what could happen. Thank you, Mike. Floor over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Clemens. And I enjoyed Mary Ellen's and Taras' presentations. I want to make 4 points relatively quickly, and then I'm happy to unpack them. I want to talk a little bit about the strategic situation. Secondly, I want to talk about adding a little bit of complexity to our image of contemporary Ukraine that I think is really missing from the discussion, but which recent events have highlighted. Thirdly, I want to talk about the failure of negotiation to prevent this war, specifically the Minsk process. And then finally, I'll tell you what I think should be done. The strategic situation is largely a stalemate, and it will remain a stalemate. There's been a cycle of magical thinking about wonder weapons. Remember the javelins and the other man-portable anti-tank weapons that did have an effect early in the war, but that effect was limited. And in fact, nobody's talking about St. Javelin anymore. Then there was the M777, Maserati of artillery pieces. By that I mean very good, but it spends lots of time in the shop. That hasn't really changed the course of the war. Ditto with HIMARS. And finally, we're talking about tanks. As Mary Ellen pointed out, the number that are going is pretty small. The American M1A1s, again, this is a fine tank, but not one that would be very useful to Ukraine or anybody else like the United States that has the infrastructure to support it. But the fundamental point about the fight now in Ukraine is it's not now and will not be in the future a combined arms tank battle. Ukraine is different. It's a war of artillery and it's a war of position. And that's not going to change, and it's not likely to change. We tend to focus in the West in periods of Ukrainian success, the Battle of Kiev, and then the operations around Kharkiv and Kherson in the fall. But there are other elements to the war. I mean, if you were to look today, if anybody's making any progress, it's the Russians. And it's no accident that the urgency about getting yet another wonder weapon has occurred now. But again, even if they get them, and if they get them in the numbers that Mary Ellen suggests, it's not going to change the fundamental fact that this war will not be decided militarily on the ground. So that's point one. Point two, the Ukraine war has become like the Spanish Civil War before World War II. And for many Americans and many in the West, it's clear-cut, black and white. Putin is bad, the Russians are deluded, and the Ukraine is completely on the side of the angels. And I think there's some truth to that. Specifically, Taras's point about the growth of Ukrainian national identity being in part a result of the Russian special military operation, I think is undeniable. But I want to emphasize two important problems with this otherwise clear narrative. One is there was another big item on the BBC website this morning, and it's been in the papers, a lot the past couple of days. And in fact, people following Ukraine events were pointing to this 2 or 3 weeks ago. The level of corruption within the Ukrainian government remains astronomically high. What we've seen with the resignations and firings is just basically the tip of the iceberg. Now, President Zelensky campaigned and won in 2019 on two big issues. One, ending corruption, and two, settling the Donbass crisis. He has certainly failed on the corruption effort. And I don't think that we can see in the events of the past couple of days anything other than continuing evidence of the sort of structural corruption of post-Soviet states that's been a problem in Ukraine and in Russia and other post-Soviet states for a long time. Secondly, I want to talk just a little bit about Ukrainian nationalism. And again, with the election of President Zelensky, the notion that Ukrainian nationalism could be civic nationalism, that Russian speakers like himself and other people could be part of the Ukrainian nationalist project. I think that that project is basically dead. And what Taras didn't mention is that a lot of the impetus behind the decreasing use of Russian in the public space has been as a result of coercive policies of the Ukrainian government, including laws passed restricting, the teaching of Russian and things like that. The other thing that's really important is that, a huge number of people, probably about 3.5 million former Ukrainian citizens, are no longer part of Ukraine and no longer the subject of these polls, the citizens of Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk. These are people, the majority of whom I think have a different view of the ethno-linguistic nationalist turn in contemporary Ukraine. I'm just going to throw this out because it's a complex issue and I don't think we can get too deeply into it. And I do want to have a minute or two for my other points, but it's problematic that the focal point of Ukrainian nationalism has become Stepan Bandera, a historical figure who I think a lot of Ukrainians respect, but they respect in much the same way that American Southerners respect Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, and ignore the impact of these historical figures. A figure who tried to collaborate with the Nazis in the early stages of the Second World War on Russian speakers and Russian citizens. It just sort of boggles the mind that we don't understand or we don't regard that as a problematic embodiment of Ukrainian nationalism. And again, I think most Ukrainian people don't see Bandera as a necessarily a ethno-linguistic model. He's sort of become the George Washington in some respects of Ukraine, but for a lot of people with historical sensibility, he's not a good role model in the same way that Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are not. Who killed Minsk? That's complicated, and I'm already running up against time. So I'm simply going to quote two Western leaders, Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel. Minsk was killed primarily by the West. The Ukrainians didn't like it, although again, soon after his election, President Zelensky was engaged in the Minsk process. But the fundamental truth is that we in the West were not eager in seeing Minsk succeed, and that's a problem. What is to be done? Well, Minsk is dead, so it's probably not even worth talking about. The war is a stalemate. I don't think it's going to be settled on the battlefield. And given that, I think we're really left with two unpalatable, but it seems to me the only options available. One is partition of the country. I don't believe that reintegrating Donbass at this point, which could have happened under Minsk, by the way, right up until February 23rd of 2022, when Putin finally recognized them as independent states. And when you think about it, I mean, Mary Ellen will hate this because it rewards a violation of international law. I'm guessing Taras will hate this because he thinks it offends Ukrainian national pride, and I certainly understand both those things. But on the other hand, when you think about it, if you're interested in continuing the Ukrainian national project, the last thing you want to have to do is try to reintegrate large numbers of people who are not a part of it. I don't think, I think it's even more with the population transfers since the beginning of the special military operation. It's even more pro-Russia in Donbass and Crimea than it was before. Finally, neutralization. And again, lots of people are going to hate this. Hasn't the Russian invasion shown that NATO membership is more pressing now than it ever was for Ukraine? I would go back to the point that this war is about NATO expansion. The red thread going back, to the 1990s has been about the increasing isolation of Russia as NATO expands. But I think NATO members, if they were honest, would tell you they don't want Ukraine in NATO. And the reason they don't want Ukraine in NATO is, given the political situation and especially the continuing level of corruption in Ukraine, Ukraine in NATO would be like another Turkey, country with questionable democratic credentials and with really problematic elements of its economy and rule of law.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Stalemate in the war, the complexity of the country, Minsk is dead, and two unpalatable options that you suggest are the realistic ones: partition or neutralization. We have a number of questions in 15 minutes. So maybe, Taras, do you want to respond quickly to what you have heard? I think that would be a polite way to start the conversation.
Of course I do. I don't know if I could do it quickly. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Thank you, Michael, for your remarks. So really, in the Flash panel, it's impossible to go deep in all of this, and we really need some history of Ukraine story. And even I will start with Stepan Bandera. So he was not a Nazi collaborator. He spent almost whole war in the concentration camp. So, and he was he had problems. So he was how to say against Jews. He was against Poles, and but he was not a Nazi collaborator. And his win of Ukrainian nationalism was fighting both Soviets and both Nazi troops during the whole war. So, but just we have to be precise about some historic facts. And what Ukrainians take from him now, it's really his fight for independence of Ukraine. They don't want to copy his nationalism in his hatred of Jews or Poles, for example. And this is really kind of discriminated between each other. Then level of corruption. So Ukraine is cleansing, from this. So when the corruption was discovered, these recent cases, just in a few days, these people were fired. So, and I think it will be, going, this way. Of course, some problem persists, but I think that they will be cured step by step.
And the last remark, Taras, Mike is nodding and he's basically shaking his head, so we don't want to go into details because we have so many questions from the audience.
And this,
one last remark, Taras.
Yeah, and about this war will not be decided on the ground. I think, that during this year, all the operations also you mentioned really clearly show that the Russia could be defeated. Of course, you need proper means, you need, proper minds, but it's possible step by step to do. And this was an evidence, what you presented actually was an evidence for this.
Thank you, Taras. I would direct two questions to Mary Ellen, and then you can say, of course, Mary Ellen, also another comment, and then we go back to Mike. So we have two questions, I think, that are relevant from a legal perspective. What are the chances that Putin and other Russian leaders will be held accountable at some future point for war crimes? That's one question. And the other question is, the argument to remove Russia from the UN Security Council, as it is not a legal successor to the Soviet Union, is that something that could be explored? Two questions for Mary Ellen.
Yes, I don't think either one should be our main focus right now. Our main focus should be a successful end to the war with Ukraine prevailing. I could not disagree more with most of Mike's remarks. And it is at that moment when we have reinstated the clear respect for the prohibition on the use of force that's at the heart of international order, on which not just Ukraine, but all of us depend. The very existence of NATO is based on a treaty. If we cannot honor our treaty commitments, then what is the point of NATO? What is the point of any of this? I go back to Taras's important point about finding meaning. And the meaning for the Ukraine war is for all of us to reconstitute that order which was envisioned after the Second World War to save succeeding nations from the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's got to be our focus. Mike, this is not a special military operation. It's a war. Call it that. Partition and neutralization will not lead to an end of the fighting because, as we heard from Taras, there will be resistance in Ukraine. There will not be acceptance of this. And remember, Ukraine will not win by weapons alone. It has had generations or succeeding weapons that have helped it do as well against all the odds, against the odds you spoke of last year. And Zelensky, who has been right on so many of these things, says that they need tanks now. So let's give them the tanks. But don't forget, the backdrop is also that Europe has cut its fossil fuel purchases from Russia. They are draining Russia dry. And maybe this will finally wake up. It may take some more months, but I see it coming, that the Russian people will not put up with what we in the rest of the world stand strong as a fundamental violation. So I would add, we do need diplomacy. It's incumbent on all of Ukraine's allies to convince these 52 other countries to come into the support, come back into international normative order.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Ellen. Obviously, Mike, you have your chance now to respond. May I just throw a question in? You can handle it all. You're so brilliant.
Sure.
And the question is, does Prigozhin and the Wagner group represent a power threat to Putin in the Russian informational sphere? And what's the most likely conclusion of this war? I mean, you made some remarks about that, but how do you see the inner Russian security situation? And please respond to Mary Ellen or Taras.
Yeah, sure. On the private military companies thing, I think that's a pretty ubiquitous phenomenon. We have in the United States have lots of private military corporations, many of which have become essential parts of our most recent military operations. The vast majority of Americans who were conducting the war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan were not soldiers. They were employees of military corporations, including some people who were, doing logistics stuff or running the Pizza Hut, but also a lot of shooters, the Blackwater, that sort of military corporation. So I don't think Wagner is that big a deal. It's certainly, within the Russian oligarchy, the Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, gets some wasta out of having this particular portfolio, and probably, in terms of his relations with Putin, it's helpful that they're perceived as being relatively more successful than some elements of the regular Russian army. But it's no different on the Ukrainian side. There are a lot of private military corporations, volunteer organizations. I think the more interesting question is on the Ukraine side, because you have Wagner on the Russian side, and that's it. On the Ukrainian side, the armed forces in the field, going all the way back to 2014, have been very, very diverse. Mary Ellen, I don't want to be flip, but I'm coming to the point where there are a lot of people in the West who want to fight a war of principle to the last Ukrainian. And I think that we're quickly getting to that point. If I'm right about stalemate, and with all due respect to your military assessment and Taras military assessment, no serious analyst, including in the Pentagon, believes that this war will be decided militarily. So this raises a question for those of us who believe in just war theory. At a certain point, a war has to have a reasonable prospect of success. The PR that we're getting from the pro-Ukraine forces suggests that victory is just on the horizon. Just more HIMARS, just more tanks, and all of a sudden things will change. I don't believe that that is going to be the case. And I think morally, we have to ask ourselves, how long are we going to prolong a war that's inflicting significant human cost, especially on non-combatants?
Thank you, Mike. So the good news is Mary Ellen and Mike, they respect each other, even though they disagree, and we can always organize a lunch to continue that conversation. I want to to bring in a question from a brilliant student, Lucy Kneip, and maybe Taras, you would be the first one to respond, if I may ask you. Her question is this: many analysts have argued that this will be a long, drawn-out war. Yet the united support for Ukraine demonstrated in the early months has waned as gas prices in Europe remain high and many US policymakers on the right are in favor of curbing aid. Can we expect Ukraine to endure if public and political support for Ukraine from the West continues to wane?
Thank you. It's a very good question. And of course, I agree that Ukraine is very much dependent on three things, because there is a war, there is military war, so it depends on weapons, and we don't produce weapons we need to win this war. Secondly, economically speaking, so Ukraine is dependent on the economic support, and we really have a gap in our budget, so which we need to cover through different kinds of aid. And also, there is a war of will, as some people call it, and it's about public opinion. And this is no less important than these first two things. And I think, what was happening, as I mentioned, during last year, since Ukraine actually liberated quite a significant part of its territory occupied by Russia after 24th of February. So really testify that Russia is not invincible. So, and one could, it's important also for the message to the public in Europe and in the United States.
Thank you, Taras. A question for Mary Ellen, if I may. Is there a strong legal case to be made that Russia is committing a genocide against Ukraine? You are muted, Mary Ellen. You are muted.
Thank you, Clemens. There is a case. The elimination of a people of their homeland is the elimination of a people. And we know more sophisticatedly that you don't need to just kill people, but you take away what their identity is. And part of Russia's tragic war against Ukraine has included, for example, the decimation of cultural heritage. Tens of thousands of works of art looted and destroyed, including over 200 museums. So this is all part of a concerted effort to show that Russia is the superior people, that there is no true separate nation of Ukraine. So the war, once you eliminate the sovereign nation, the member of the United Nations, as well as all these markers of who they are as a people, that is genocide. But I want to respond also to say, we've come to see these grave human rights violations as the leading issues. In fact, war should remain the leading issue of what we should seek to prohibit.
Thank you.
If it weren't for the war, we would not be seeing this attempt at genocide. It's the prohibition on resort to force, which has to win the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Ellen. That's a segue to the last question that I will ask Mike, if I may. What can and should the international community and the US do to end the war?
I think the most important thing that we can do is broker a ceasefire and a settlement. And again, I'm under no illusions that a settlement along the lines of what I'm proposing would not play well in many Ukrainian towns and cities. But nonetheless, the essence of leadership is to be able to persuade the public of hard but necessary decisions. I believe that President Zelensky had that mandate after 2019, and I think he, he might have been able to pull this off. I don't think subsequently that he lived up to that potential. And I really wonder if he's the man for the peace. The one thing I'd say about genocide, and I don't agree with this, but the Russians have argued very much along the lines of what Mary Ellen's arguing for a genocide, not the physical extermination of Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine, but a cultural genocide, and the effort to restrict Russian language in the public sphere and teaching and things like that. Now, I don't buy that as a genocide, but Mary Ellen, if you start embracing that, it's going to put you in
Mike,
maybe
I'm sorry, that's a false equivalence. It's a false equivalence.
There's nothing false about it. It's exactly the same thing.
Not friends and colleagues, I apologize on behalf of our format here. We can continue afterwards. I want to give the very last word to Taras. Just one sentence, a message from Ukraine to us here, and thank you for all you do.
Thank you, Clemens. Maybe on a personal note, because today is a special date, not only because we have this panel, but me and my wife celebrate 26th anniversary of our marriage, and I belong to 30% of those who are separated from his family. So I hope that this year we will kind of get again together, and Ukraine will prevail.
Congratulations, Taras. Love will conquer it all. Dear friends, we are at time. I want to thank Mike and Mary Ellen, and especially Taras, for their inputs and wisdom, and also the respectful disagreements that we have. Thank you to the audience for your interest and for your questions. I want to thank our colleagues who made this panel possible, especially Tim Checkley, Grant Osborne, Grania McEvoy, and Becca Prince. And as you know, I always conclude our panels with this line. On the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our university president, Father Jenkins, has issued a statement where he said, "The former oppressors of Ukraine are now known by another name and are waging war under a different flag. But the trauma is no less today than in the past in this nation that has suffered far too much. Now more than ever, our friends in Ukraine are in need of healing and hope. We at Notre Dame stand in solidarity with all peace-loving people worldwide in demanding an end to this invasion of a sovereign nation. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them." Thank you so much, and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.